Dr. Keith Eccolo, it's here. Hi, Keith. I'm so happy to see you. So, Keith Edward Cantú is a postdoctoral fellow in Asian religious traditions at the Center for the Study of World Religions, Harvard Divinity School, where he's helping to curate the Transcendence and Transformation database. Prior to this, he was visiting assistant professor in religious studies at St. Lawrence University. Keith continues to publish research on early modern yoga, tantra in Indic languages like Bengali, Sanskrit, and Tamil, on Baul songs and medieval Sufism, and on a global esoteric movements like the Theosophical Society and Thelema. And his most recent book that we are going to discuss now is like a three universally spread, Sri Sabhapati Swami and Śivarājayoga. And with us discussing this amazing book, very full of details, I've loved it, thank you, Kate, is Raphaël Voix, who is a senior research fellow at the CNRS, Paris, and a member of the Center for South Asian and Himalayan Studies at the HESS, Paris, and an associated member of the French Institute of Pondicherry. He holds a PhD in anthropology from the University of Paris-West Nanterre La Défense. His work is focused on the study of the social dimensions of Hindu asceticism on the basis of ethnographic surveys conducted mainly in West Bengal and accessory in Tamil Nadu. And he is now conducting a research project on the institutionalization of yoga in contemporary India, notably through its entry as an academic subject in Indian public universities. And the floor is yours.
Thank you. First, can you hear me well? Okay,
yes.
Great. So wonderful, very nice to see all of you. And I would like really to express my gratitude to Lucy and Daniela for all this work, and also the entire team for organizing this symposium and for inviting me to participate in the discussion. And it's a real pleasure to see since this morning so many familiar faces, esteemed colleagues, and dear friends. So entitled Like a Tree Universally Spread, Sri Sabhapati Swami and Śivarājayoga, Keith's book is an expanded version of his PhD thesis conducted under the supervision of David Gordon White. Its aim is to bring to the fore a forgotten character of modern yoga originating from South India. To do so, Keith has drawn upon a wide variety of sources. Firstly, the writing of I will do it well, Sabhapati Swami in Sanskrit, English, Tamil, Telugu, Bengali, and Hindi. Secondly, during 1 year period in Tamil Nadu as a fellow of the American Institute of Indian Studies, he visited numerous sites associated with Sabhapati Swami's life and accessed a range of archives, including those of the Theosophical Society and of the state of Tamil Nadu. This enabled him to reconstruct Sabhapati Swami's life, analyze his different works and their reception. Briefly summarized, Sabhapati Swami was born in 1828 to a wealthy family of Telugu or Tamil Shaiva Brahmins in a temple village in the south of Madras. He was educated in an English medium Protestant missionary school, after which he became a government employee. He married and accompanied his father-in-law, a textile merchant, on a trip to Burma. There, he is said to have met some Buddhist monks from whom he learned that Hinduism, Vedanta, and Buddhism is the same. Upon returning from Burma, he left his job and took initiation in his home village with a Tamil Virashaiva guru he had known since his childhood. After his guru's death, he went to live in Nagaur, port city in Tamil Nadu, known for being the home of the 16th century Sufi saint Al-Hamid Nagori, a member of the Qadiriya order. He then went to an ashram in the south of the Nilgiris, where he encountered his second guru in the line of Agastya and renounced the world. In 1879, Sabhapati Swami reached Lahore, the capital of British Punjab, where he gives lectures and meet at least 3 people who would become instrumental in disseminating his teaching: the 2 founders of the Theosophical Society, Olcott and Blavatsky, as well as the prominent Bengali theosophist and Hindu reformer, Chandra Basu. And after, he settled back in Tamil Nadu, where he gathers a community of followers and teaching meditation halls his practical methods to realize what he calls Shiva's Raja Yoga, a state of, I quote, steadfast communion with Brahman, or the infinite spirit, until his death in the 1920s. In addition to his disciples in Tamil Nadu and some theosophists in India who studied his works, his teaching have been transmitted within modern occultist movements, such as the Telema of Aleister Crowley and the works of William Estes. So this is a wonderful book, full of details, as you said earlier, Daniela, which make it sometimes hard to read, but very interesting because you give us all the material you have at hand. So help us to follow you from the beginning to the end in your reasoning, so we can redo your reasoning, and that's absolutely wonderful. It is also, I believe, an important contribution to the field of modern yoga studies for 3 reasons. First, the topic was understudied. So I like the parable of a colleague who says that history usually focuses on ships that have reached their destination. And we know little about the ships that never left the shore or boats that sank on their way. Well, similarly, we know a lot about yogis whose heritage is still alive among contemporary practitioners, but less on yogis who have not been able to have a community to perpetuate their living memory. So while Sabhapati Swami was known for his teaching prior to Vivekananda, and while he survived the later, his character was almost exclusively known within the Academy of Esotericism, but not yet taken into account within the great history of modern yoga, and Keith's book gives justice to that. Second reason for which I think it's a great, interesting book is the methodology. Keith belongs to the small elite of Indologists who, on top of Sanskrit, master contemporary and medieval forms of North Indian and South Indian languages, Bengali, Tamil, and Hindi, and he's thus able to compare not only the reception of these works in one region, Tamil Nadu, but also how they were borrowed and translated in other vernacular languages, and what he calls this meso-local dynamics. And I think this is extremely rich approach. And lastly, this book is important, I believe, because it contributes to a new area of research, which is, as Keith calls, the modern occult yoga, and articulate it with the modern yoga. So I'm done now with this small summary of the book, and I will move on to this different set of questions that I have. So first set of questions is regarding Sabhapati Swami's relation with Islam. So you mentioned that when he returns from Burma, he stays for 6 months to 2 years, it's not very clear, in Nagaur, which is this port city in Tamil Nadu, known for the cult of Shah Hamid, the Sufi sent from the Qadiriya Tariqa. And you mentioned that Shah Hamid is important because he was himself a student of Muhammad Ghaus, who is none else than the translator of the Ocean of Life, the Arabic translation of the Amrita Kunda that we have a translation thanks to Karl Ernst. So, but you do not mention why he goes and stays there so long. So one interpretation could be that this stay is only mentioned to give weight to his later claim, and I quote, that he gained the truth of the Muslim faith, learned the truth of Muhammad and the Quran, and thus affirmed the superiority of the theological system he defends. But another interpretation could be that it is related to the powers attributed to the saint. We know that Shah Hamid's cult is widespread among Hindus in Burma since at least the beginning of the 20th century, and probably much earlier. We also know that it is widespread among the indentured Hindus of Mauritius or La Réunion. In fact, we know that these workers brought his cult, Hindu workers, brought his cult to the Mascarenes Islands. And the reason for this prevalence of that, they call him Nagaur Baba, the cult of Nagaur Baba is known because he protects his followers during sea voyage. That's his specialty. So I wonder if you think that Sabhapati Swami could have met Nagaur Baba before he went to Burma to prevent any boats sinking on the way, and needed to pay homage to him when he comes back, or if it's another option, he would have met him in Burma, his cult in Burma, and then would have been curious to see his cult when he comes back to Tamil Nadu. That would be my first question.
Should I address it now or wait for the next
Oh,
question? I'm happy
I don't
to.
know. I
No,
can.
no. Answer, Keith, because
Yeah,
we
okay,
want the
think so. Perfect.
dialogue.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, sounds great. Well, thanks, Raphael, for the wonderful response and question here. You know, the idea of Sabhapati Swami reaching the Nagor Darga, that's present in most of his hagiographies. And so it was really difficult to sort of create a rigid timeline of when exactly he would have gone, if it was either before Burma or after the trip. What's interesting, and I visited the site, the Nagor Darga, and spent the night. I think what's interesting is that there is mention of him speaking with fakirs there at the site, and there's also a record. I'm forgetting exactly the reference, but it's in the book of previously a prince visiting that area and interacting with a Malang fakir. And so it's clear that there's some sort of allusion to powers in that community. I think you're right to point out, and the power as well of the Nagor Baba. I like that. I hadn't heard that sort of that epithet before. And the barakat, right, the blessing that he gives to people who sort of you know, are able to be in that realm and be in that sort of space with him. I think that the notion of sea voyage is very interesting. It's clear that the textile trade was also a part of Sabhapati's life, going to Burma with his father-in-law, supposedly. So it's very possible that he could have, you know, been grateful to the Nagor Baba. At the same time, what's really interesting is that seems to be the most important Islamic site in Tamil Nadu in general. And so it would have been just well known to anyone. So it could have been just used as a part of his hagiography. But I wonder if there's something deeper there, since, you know, we know that among the Siddhars, for example, right, the Siddhars, or, you know, Siddha in Sanskrit, right, these also included Muslim Siddhas originally. And so we have the example of Iramadevar, right, or Yakapa, who had this story, you know, this legend of flying to Mecca and, you know, after consuming a mercurial pill. And so these days, you know, the common impression, and I think even in Sabhapati's time, the common impression is that all the Siddhas are Shaiva, or, you know, are essentially kind of within this larger Hindu fold. But in Tamil Nadu, it wasn't always that way. And so it's possible that he was sort of trying to, while at the same time, clearly his hagiography is pushing for Hinduism, he's still sort of trying to, you know, gesture to the larger movement there. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this answer. I have another set of questions regarding his family. What is striking about the portrait that you are dressing of Sabhapati Swami is that he's a layman who does not take renunciation until later in his life, when he's around 30 years old. But before that, he's worked as a clerk. He's married. He has close ties with his in-laws because he goes 2 years in Burma with, you know, his father-in-law. He has 2 sons. He has some property on which he can live when he comes back from Burma. And on top of that, if I understand well, he takes renunciation, or his first guru is from the village where he originates. He's the same guru as his father's guru. And then he continues to preach and settle in the same region where he was born, Tamil Nadu. So what happened to all these family ties? What about his ex-wife, his children? Did they all disappear? Did they all their colleagues? What is this sociological background of his first disciple? I mean, we know that in many cases, under the guise of spiritual succession, renaissance can in fact put forward the blood succession, right? So their spiritual disciple being in fact their blood son converted into spiritual disciple. So I'm just wondering if you found any traces of all this of his lay life before taking renunciation?
Yeah, it's a wonderful question. The answer is no. I couldn't find anything about his personal life. It was very, very difficult. I looked, you know, in many records and, you know, scoured through all of his extant, you know, published literature, and then even, you know, talking to people at the extant Jiva Samadhi, or, you know, tumulus where he's revered there. And there's nothing about it. What's even stranger about this is that in the first of his hagiographies, published in English in 1880 by Sri Chandra Boshu, or S.C. Vasu, right, as he's known as well, there is mention of his father-in-law and children. But then in the later Tamil hagiographies, they aren't mentioned at all. And in fact, there's even no mention of a father-in-law. He actually goes to Burma with his father, I believe, instead of father-in-law. So there's some strange sort of maybe omission also of his former family life, maybe to make the act of his accepting sannyas more maybe palatable to people who sort of, didn't believe maybe you could be, married and have children and then, renounce. Maybe there was some sort of, tension, certainly, about his previous family ties. And so, yeah, it's a great question. And I think he's also responding to the fact that in Lahore, I'm forgetting the exact name, but it's also in the book, there was another renunciate who had, I think the founder of the Dev Samaj, if I'm not mistaken, who had taken renunciation, but apparently under false pretexts. And so, he ends up having a family after, and it becomes very controversial to the students in Lahore who kind of think, oh, you're a fake sannyasi or something. So it's clear there's a kind of a wider discourse about how close you are with your family and your children. And I think that gradually that was sort of faded out of the picture. But in terms of the property and the money, that's also a very a great insight here, since we knew that, at least initially he was well off. He could live off of, some of his income. He came from, kind of a well-known family in what is today Velachery in south of Chennai. And when I talked to people at the tumulus of Sabhapati Swami, they were completely, treating this fact that Swamis and sannyasis in that period had a lot of money as completely normal. They were like, the people there had a lot of money, they had a lot of property, and in fact, they fed a lot of people. They often kept their money kind of secret, they didn't really show it off, but they had property, they had a lot of wealth. And so there was kind of, even though you could be a sannyas or sannyasi and accept sannyas, there was an acceptance that you would still be able to have some kind of economy there. You weren't sort of necessarily poor and destitute. So that's another interesting maybe dynamic. I don't know how unique that is to South India in the Tamil context, but it's definitely there. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
I have another set of questions regarding his relationship basically with Hindu orthodoxy and politics in a general sense. I think there's something very interesting in your book and on Sabhapati's writing, that he's beyond, the description on his cosmological system, is that he's explaining his views on other religion, including Islam and Christianity, but also other movements of reform, such as the Brahmo Samaj or Arya Samaj, on theosophy, on atheism also. He writes a lot on that. But all this is only theological. He's only explaining his position from a theological point of view, how it differs from this. But it seems that he doesn't engage with other movements at that time that are important in North India. And I'm thinking about all the movement around Sanatana Dharma that is constructing itself against the reform movements of the Arya Samaj and the Brahma Samaj, and that are reshaping completely the idea of Orthodox Hinduism and are defending the idea of being representative of Hindu race. Similarly, I'm surprised that although his first guru has some egalitarian teaching, as you say, it seems that he doesn't engage at all with the discourse on social reform that other important authors at the time have engaged with. Of course, Vivekananda is a big one of them. So I wonder, what he says about all this.
Yeah, it's another very great question. So really, he is, I think, embodying two different streams as far as sort of the discourse about religion during this time. One of the streams is certainly the Theosophical Society, right? Which is emerging and trying to kind of promote a sort of human brotherhood, you know, and create a kind of religious pluralism, yes, you know, with its own ends and its own agenda as well. But there's another movement there that's coming to the fore in his writing as well, and that's the Virashaiva movement. And even though they aren't calling themselves always as such, they just kind of call themselves Saiva or Shaiva, such as his guru. There was this sort of wider milieu of warring sects during this time. And so I gesture to Eric Steinschneider's work, as well as Sridhar Raman has written about this. There was this sort of attempt to get beyond caste. There was this sort of attempt to bridge Shaiva Siddhanta and Vedanta, to bridge Shaiva and Vaishnava kind of sectarian relations during this time. And Sabhapati is really emerging out of that. And I think he's carrying that with him as he's going. And then once he gets to Lahore in 1879 and 1880, he's encountering these samajas really at the exact moment in which they are being formed. And so there's this brief moment in which I think that idea kind of coalesces with or his sort of this sort of Virashaiva position coalesces with the samajas and the Theosophical Society at that particular time. But then there's a kind of divergence. And I think this divergence happens, you can trace it loosely with Srish Chandra Boshu or Vasu's involvement, right? Because he gradually falls away from the picture. And so as he's involved in an editor and in his initial English works, you see actually some examples of reform kind of snippets of text there. Like there is in his 1883 work, the psychological spiritual philosophy and science of yoga. You do have a whole chapter on cows, and I believe cow killing as well, and sort of, you know, consumption of beef and so on. So there are some questions about that, as well as questions about marriage, and so there's some gender kind of normativity going on. There's some sort of discourse in there, but it almost feels inserted into the text, and that gradually really, like, it falls away from his later Tamil works and his work in Hindi that becomes sort of exclusively focused. I mean, maybe not exclusively, but the majority of the text is on sort of the yogic practices and sort of the, you know, the more esoteric teachings of yoga. And so I think that there's a time in which his works sort of converge with that. But then once he goes back and establishes himself in Tamil Nadu, that's not the concern anymore. He's able to kind of plug into this, you know, sort of pan-Hindu sort of vision that he's trying to create, that also is explicitly, I mean, it's used in numerous places for people of any caste, and even people who are outside of any caste. So that's sort of an interesting dynamic there. So I would say, at the risk of being reductive, I would say it's almost Hindu without being Hindutva, if that makes sense. I mean, in the sense of without the later sort of Reformation aspect there. Yeah.
Yeah, which come later. I mean, Hindutva.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean.
Yeah, but so that brings us to the question on his community of followers. So there's this ideal to, you know, gather all castes and all that. So I'm a bit curious about his community of followers, because you use three different terms. You use a student, you use a disciple, and then there's a third term. So is there a difference between these two? I was not sure to understand well. And in your use of these two terms, and there's a third term that I think is very interesting. I've never seen it. It's admirers. So there's no devotees, but there's admirers. And I think it's an emic term, right? He uses it, or they uses it, whatever. And I was a bit curious also on that particular term, because if I understand well, and I will just quote Olcott, because there's this great story that, you know, he said to Olcott that he flew to the Mount Kailash and saw Mahadeva there. then Olcott says, and that's the beginning of their rupture with Theosophy. So I quote Olcott: "Whatever good opinion we may have formed of him before was spoiled by a yarn he told us about his exploit as a yogi. He had, he said, been taken up to Lake Manasarova, Tibet, into the high air and been transported 200 miles along the high level to Mount Kailash, where he saw Mahadeva. Ingenious foreigner as Blavatsky and I may have been, we could not we could not digest such a ridiculous falsehood as that." And this is very interesting because, I mean, they tolerate many other very bizarre stories, but that one they could not tolerate. So he's controversial, basically. And so does admirers mean that he has haters also? Are they people that, you know, thought he was a fake yogi, or he was a liar or something?
Yeah, I think what's interesting about that is that the admirers are also sometimes the haters, or at least they're the reconcilers in a way. And I think if you look at Sri Chandra Boshu, especially this Vasu connection, he actually adds a footnote in some of the later published editions of Sabhapati's texts where he's mentioning this flight to Mount Kailasa. And he says, this must have been as real to Sabhapati Swami as his physical body, but it was actually an astral body, essentially. Like, it was this kind of astral experience. And so there's a gradual sort of trying to almost make sense for Sabhapati Swami of his own experience and sort of, fit it within a certain frame of, oh, it must have been some kind of spiritual flight. And I think that his admirers gradually sort of take that position for him. It's not that they disbelieve him or, despise him in any way or think that he's fake, but perhaps a little bit naive, right? Perhaps he didn't have the Lockean rational upbringing that someone like Henry Olcott would have had, and, to say this is real and this is because it's rational, and this is unreal, and so these sorts of debates or divisions between mind and matter, so to speak, were not as important to Sabhapati, or they were important, but within his specific cosmology, right? That I try to lay out as best as I can. That's very elaborate, right? With the sort of the spiritual and physical aspects there. But I think that these grades of people in terms of his inner circle really expose and tell us a lot about the yogi himself. So I tried my best to really explain that there were an inner circle of sort of people who sponsored these texts and sponsored these works, and there are lists of these people. Some of them were like, head butlers, or, they were also, involved in various sort of colonial urban jobs and posts, and they were helping to support Sabhapati. But others of them were actually, people who wanted to become a yogi, and they are the ones who kind of become his initiated students and disciples. But then at the same time, it's interesting that anyone could kind of be an admirer, in the sense that he sets up these diagrams. One of these diagrams is explicitly intended to grant a kind of remote initiation. It's actually a diagram for giving Diksha. And so I think that he was using print culture and diagrams in order to sort of create admirers, almost like a celebrity culture in a way. But at the same time, this culture was designed to have very real spiritual results, and that you would sort of, have this picture in front of you and you would be able to gravitate towards the yogi. And so that's another kind of admirer. And then, yes, you do have these lists of admirers, using that word in English, of people like Sri Chandra Boshu and others who were all across India at that time, and especially including in places like Bombay and Gujarat. And you have admirers who are close and are supporting Sabhapati Swami, but maybe not getting too close, as you say, because of they're also trying to navigate the Theosophical Society. They're trying to navigate these other reform movements that are probably in competition with Sabhapati or don't see him as necessarily as politically or socially engaged.
I hesitate to jump in and break up this fascinating dialogue, but I wanted to go to Elizabeth and Michaelis, if possible, please.
Yeah, just a question. I think Raphaël mentioned at the beginning that this was an important study for modern occult yoga. I'm not sure whether Keith also mentioned this label during his very rich elaboration. Could you just explain to me what you mean by that, and if and whether such modern occult yoga, which forms it has, if it's still going on somewhere in India or in the globalized field, and if so, where could we find it? I mean, Theosophical Society, perhaps, things like that, or Crowley. But is it still alive? I had a bit of the impression that it was not quite alive, or maybe, yes?
Yes, it's a great question, and thank you, Dr. De Michelis, for that question. So it is very much alive. Modern occult yoga, I was not bold enough to use it in the book here. It's something that has sort of come to light a little bit later, but it does live on, if I can sort of give some show and tell. As Raphaël did mention, so there's an alternative religious movement, Thelema, which has its own kind of set of holy books that are inspired by the Crowley stuff. And then there's also Franz Hartmann, who was a theosophical author who translated Sabhapati's literature into German, a good amount of it, and kind of had his own commentary. And he's all bringing it into sort of discourse with magic during this time. And it lives on in really pockets. And so I've felt that it's important to sort of, building off of the typology that you have helped to create, which I find useful, the modern postural yoga and these sort of, different dimensions of yoga. I think that modern occult yoga is another dimension that sort of combines those things, but it also lives on in unexpected ways. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's alive and kicking, right?
It's alive. Yeah, it's very much alive. Yeah.
Does it combine at all with, the more Western magic, like Celtic and things like that? I mean, I suppose anybody could do anything, but, or, the more Eastern and Western magical. Sorry, we're going too much off topic. No need to answer.
Yeah. I mean, just to respond quickly, I think the short answer is that it really challenges these binaries of Eastern and Western. And I think the modern occultists were really explicitly trying to do that. I mean, so Crowley, for example, trying to blend ceremonial magic with yoga, that was a major project for him. Today, he's mostly, remembered as some kind of, black magician or occultist or, just only doing magic, but he was trying to do yoga. I mean, that's pretty impressive. And the Theosophists, everyone knows that their main interest was yoga. Granted, it was a specific, interpretation and view on yoga, but yeah, it's definitely there.
Thank you.
Keith, I have a couple of questions, but I will start just one. I mean, I was very much impressed by your work on Hindi, English, and so on. And I would like to, what was for you interesting, like looking at the teachings of Sabhapati Swami in English and in Bengali and in Hindi, what was the most striking difference in the teachings, according to you? Because I'm always like, thinking about thinking about my experience. For me, it's like sadhus are always trying to not manipulate, but what we have seen also in this symposium, adapting their knowledge to the audience. And so, I mean, I think it's very much important to think about the audience of these books. And so what is the main difference that you find in them, like content-wise?
Yeah, so first of all, Daniela, I wish that my Hindi were as good as you speaking to sadhus. I can read Hindi well, because of the background of Sanskrit. But really, what was interesting was seeing the ways in which these regional sort of elaborations of Sabhapati's translations and works, how they include sort of little tidbits and they focus on certain things that do tend to focus on the region. So for example, the Bengali translation of Sabhapati's lectures has a poem that mentions Sri Chaitanya or Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, and he's not mentioned anywhere in any of Sabhapati's other works. And so you have sort of also translations of his English poems into Bengali and given a kind of Bengali meter, so they sound almost like a folk song, but they're from these English poems that he had composed. And so that's one way. And then the Hindi works, or the main Hindi work really contains sort of gestures to the beginnings of the Hindi language. I'm forgetting exactly who sponsored that Hindi work. I'm going to have to get back to you on that, but it's in the book. There's a certain press that was starting to arise during this time, and there's actually sort of this notion of a kind of Dravidian sort of approach to yoga that then is getting translated and also made into sort of a pan-North Indian identity. And so Sabhapati is known for speaking what's called then the Dravid Pasha. So it's not, Tamil isn't even mentioned, it's Dravid Pasha, which is interesting. And that then gets sort of, repurposed in the Hindi work, but then it's much more Sanskritized, right? In conversation with sort of how Devanagari would have to be, like spellings are standardized in certain ways that are not standardized, even though you have a lot of this Mani Prabhalam in his Tamil works, this sort of Sanskrit-Tamil hybrid language, the spellings aren't always consistent. And so I think you can look at kind of how these terms, and I've tried to do this with the lexicon, really, how terms throughout these regional works are really elaborated and expressed in ways in which the audiences would understand. And so one brief other example is in the North Indian, in the Hindi work, you have chakra used for these centers, right? The word chakra. But in the Tamil works, you have kamalam, lotus. And so that's another way, like certain words that would be different in other technical contexts that are here just synonyms by accident of translation and interpretation.
Yeah,
Okay.
I mean, that's very
So,
interesting. Yes, yeah, Ruth, sorry.
Can we go to Raphaël for one final question? Lucy says it's the last question.
No, I said I have 100 questions more, but there's one I cannot let go. All of the rest I can. It's a very quick question. You mentioned that how print culture is important in the disseminating his teaching through books and diagrams. But we also know how important iconography is in the dissemination of a cult. And I wonder, do we have any photos of him? And if not, why? I mean, it's a moment where we have plenty of photos of these gurus.
Yeah, so no photos. We have the diagrams like right here, right? Pen and ink diagrams, and you have diagrams that are designed to give initiation, but you're right, no photos. Someone, I'm forgetting exactly who mentioned this to me at a conference, had mentioned that it might have been Gudrun Boneman, that there was sort of a taboo about photographing prominent sadhus or gurus during this time, simply because there was a belief that it could sort of take their energy, that like the light from the camera or the capture of their image in a photographic form could somehow reduce their energy or power or charisma in some way. I don't know if that's true. I haven't found other examples of that. I think what seems to be more persuasive here is that there were not any photographers who were interested in photographing Sabhapati. So I think that if there were any that survived, the technology wasn't there in his books to reproduce a photograph. The technology was there to reproduce the pen and ink drawings, but not, and the woodblock prints, but not photographs. So they might have been there, but they just didn't survive. So that's another.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.